Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a video that is all about books that I have recently DNF'd. I have been in a bit of a reading slump, and I'm gonna say that it's been off and on over the past couple of months because I feel like I said the same thing in March, that I just felt like I was entering a reading slump. And the past couple of weeks, specifically just the end of April, really saw me struggling with a lot of books. And I used to do videos on my channel where I would kind of wrap up 5 classics that I had DNF'd recently because I just think there should be less of a stigma about disliking a classic or DNFing one. Even though the response to those is not always positive because people tell you to finish it or people tell you you didn't get it. Yeah, I got it. And so I just decided in general that I really should probably do more videos like this when I DNF, because a lot of times when I DNF, I don't intend to do it permanently. I do sometimes intend to come back to the book. I think I struggle to fully DNF because it seems like there are a lot of people here in the online book community who just don't do it at all. And so I think since coming into the realm of booktube, I've often had a little voice in the back of my head saying, but what if it gets better at the end? And that really doesn't matter. The end of the book shouldn't save it for you. And so I want to be freer with DNFing, but I do recognize that a lot of times, such as when you're in a slump, you're just not in the mood to read at all. So I have 4 books that I DNF'd while in this reading slump, specifically here in the past couple of weeks. And some of them I got rather far in, some of them I did not make it that far in. And so those are the ones I would like to prioritize. Those are the ones that I can definitely foresee myself coming back to. The first thing that I want to talk about is a thriller. And I think this is a weird thing to say that I DNF'd because I'll tell you fully, I often turn to a thriller or a mystery when I feel like I'm in a slump because there's something about having to figure out elements of the story that I think keeps me compelled enough to want to finish something. And so the fact that I DNF'd this really says something to me, and that is In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. I picked this up on the heels of reading The Only Survivors by Megan Miranda, which was one of my favorite books in April and was similarly kind of a thriller set in North Carolina. And that's what this is. This is set at Duquette University. I guess it's just kind of playing on Duke, but it's actually in Winston-Salem, which I think is crazy, really crazy. It's weird that a made-up school, I think that's clearly playing on Duke, would have been put in Winston-Salem. I just think it's interesting. Anyways, this is kind of like something happened in the past when everyone was in school, someone died, and years later, kind of at a reunion, we are kind of finally coming to terms with what happened or finally finding out who killed her. And so there's like a lot of built-in secrets here. And I think on the surface, this sounded really good to me. A lot of people have rated this as one of their favorite thrillers that's been published in the past few years. And specifically, a lot of people have really loved this who are also into kind of the dark academia aesthetic, who really like dark academia books. And so I think that's partially what pulled me in, is thinking that this might be on par with something like The Likeness. The reason I put this down, I think, is not that I thought the book was objectively bad. I personally just didn't care about the mystery, but the main thing that I really hated about this book was the main character. I just truly could not stand being in her head. And this also has like alternating chapters, one chapter in the past telling you what was going on when all of these friends first met each other in college, and then chapters like right now when they're getting together for the reunion. And you would think, as is always the case, one of these chapters is more interesting than the other. And you would probably think in this case that the past would be more interesting. It certainly is not. And I really dreaded it. I just thought, why do we need these past timelines? I think that everything that happened in the past can be conveyed to us in the present. I think I must just be someone who doesn't care for that format, or maybe in the end, it's done well sometimes, like in The Only Survivors. I personally had no problem with it, and I think it was the perfect vehicle to tell that story. Here, it just felt needless to me, and I despised the main character so much that I put the book down at about 90 pages in. This isn't that long. I think this is a permanent DNF. This is a book I do not see myself coming back to. And I think it's a real shame, but I think I also maybe was expecting something from this book that it's not going to give. I don't think it's going to be very dark academia at all. And I think that has nothing to do with the book or how the book is marketed. I don't think it's been particularly marketed as dark academia. That's the way reviewers have talked about it. And I think a lot of times people just think if something is set at a school, then it qualifies as dark academia. That's not true. You know, that is not true. This was a fairly big disappointment to me, and I fully do not see myself coming back to this. I think this next one is going to sound kind of wild to y'all because I feel like it's going to come out of nowhere. I don't think I've mentioned this book anywhere else, but that is Heaven Official's Blessing. This is the first in a really long series of Chinese light novels, and this has taken the internet by storm, book talk by storm, and I think specifically this author has several different series. I'm not sure if this is the most popular one, but this is the one I could find the first volume of, and it's about a guy who has ascended to godhood essentially because he was such a great human being. He has ascended to godhood, but something happens that means he's cast back down into the human realm. And this happens multiple times. And the book is basically him trying to ascend to godhood again. And there's something very funny about that setup, and there's something very lighthearted about it, which is kind of why I wanted to pick this up. This is one I fully intend to come back to. Essentially, the reason that I DNF'd this is that I was trying to read something light, but I really did not want to commit to another long form series. I just thought I needed a one and done. So essentially I put this down because I felt like where I got to in the reading experience, I just knew that the book was not going to have a full ending. It was just going to fold right over into book 2, because I know that's how they do this a lot of the time, especially these things that used to be web novels. They have kind of cut it at an arbitrary point that doesn't necessarily feel like an ending. And so I thought, if I finish this, I'm not even going to feel like I finished a complete chapter of the story. I also have just heard stuff like this really compared to like long form Wattpad. And I know y'all know I have been on my Wattpad binge in the past few months. And there is a lot about Wattpad that's just suspend your disbelief because nothing makes any kind of sense in these fan fictions, nothing. And so I'm willing to suspend my disbelief quite a bit, but I think what bothered me about this was how poorly translated it was. And you see a lot of poor writing on stuff like Wattpad, of course, but you're reading that for free. This is something that has been passed over multiple times to enter the realm of traditional publishing. And so you would think at some point in that process that someone really would have cleaned this up. I'm talking sentences alone, like truly one sentence will not make any kind of sense grammatically. And I'm personally sitting there wondering how it made it through multiple sets of eyes reading this, because you would assume the translator is not the only one who read this over. And so I'm willing to suspend my disbelief. I'm really willing to go along with a silly story. I'm willing to go along with what you might think is objectively poor writing. I just really want something fun. But to me, this was odd. It's like it was picked up by a traditional publishing source, and yet I feel like the fan translation of it would probably have been better. And I often hear that about stuff like this. And there was a lot about it that was silly too. I just didn't feel like I understood the rules of the world. I didn't feel like I understood some of like the character motivations or how this happened. There wasn't a lot of explanation. And once again, I think if you kind of go along for the ride, I don't necessarily care. I can tell you how far I'm willing to go with suspension of disbelief, because I read a fanfic this past month that was a deserted island story, like everyone wound up on this deserted island. The reason that this happened is that everyone was on a cruise ship. And at dinner one night, the captain comes out, and of course he's drunk, and it's storming. All of the crew are like, "Captain, what's going on? Like, why are you literally not captaining the ship right now?" And he's like, "Oh, it's okay. It's on autopilot." Now me, that immediately sucked me out of the story, and I was like, what does he even mean? But then I went along with it because really, who cares? And then the captain even laughs and he's like, "I'm just kidding. There is no autopilot on a cruise ship." And I mean, really, objectively, it's silly and it doesn't make any kind of sense. But do I care? I care about them getting onto the deserted island and really how that happens. It doesn't have to make a lot of sense. And I guess the difference is that I'm thinking something on Wattpad is free. And something like Heaven's Official Blessing was also once a web novel that you could read for free. But to me, once it made that jump into traditional publishing, I just kind of think either it would have been edited down or it would have been given more room to breathe in certain instances. And so I think what I have to do with this is what I do when I read Wattpad, which is turn off critical thinking brain. Like, I'm just here for a good time. And that's essentially why I picked this up, is I thought I need something that would count towards my Goodreads goal if I'm going to read, silly romances. And so I'm going to come back to this. I got maybe 100 pages in, which doesn't feel very long. It's a substantial part of this book, weirdly enough, because I think this isn't even 300 pages, though it looks like it's a lot longer than that. But at that 100-page point, I did not feel like there was going to be a fully contained plot in this single book. I knew it was just going to roll over into the next one. And so I just decided to make an executive decision and DNF it for the time being, but I'm certainly going to come back to this. We then have The Gods Will Have Blood by Anatole, France, which is a modern classic that was written in the early 1900s, and it is historical fiction set during the French Revolution. And I cannot tell you how much about that description really appeals to me. I mean, there are many different reasons why I picked this up. And I think if you want to know, it's been sitting on my shelf for maybe 2 years now. I remember when I hauled it, and I think it was in 2021. And it is really, really short. And that's what really pains me, is I feel like all of the books that I have DNF'd recently are objectively not long books. And so they are books that really wouldn't have taken me that long to finish. And so I'm kind of feeling guilty. I feel like maybe I should have committed to some of these, but life's too short to read something that you aren't enjoying. And that was certainly the case here. Even though this is a really short book, this was tedious. I just was bored reading this. And I think it's an odd thing to say because, weirdly enough, it feels like a lot was going on in this in a short amount of time, but it felt equally like that wasn't given enough time to breathe, but also like not enough was happening, which is a really weird space to be in. And really the reason I was interested in this is not even so much the French Revolution component of it, though that was definitely part of it, but it's that the main character is an artist. And I think his mistress is also an artist. And so there was going to be like a wider conversation about art ongoing in this, as well as about the French Revolution. In defense of this book, I will say when I'm reading about the French Revolution, I often find myself having to look up things on the side because for some odd reason, a lot about the French Revolution has not locked itself into my long-term memory. And so I think this was also going to be pretty dense in parts, especially to be reading while you're in a slump. I felt like this was going to take a lot out of me, but more than anything, it's that I was bored. And really, if you don't have me gripped right now, what is the point? I've decided to kind of make a vow to myself that I'm only going to read books that I'm really enjoying. And I think I force myself with a lot of things to finish them. And then in the end, sometimes I'm glad that I did that. But right now, I just would rather be spending my time with books that I am truly loving. And so this very well may have a lot of redeeming qualities. The end may make up for it. I don't feel like I got very far in this, maybe not even 50 pages, but I just truly could not keep going with it. I'm going to keep it around because I do think the potential is there for me to come back to this one. And so please, if you have read this, let me know your thoughts on it down below. It seems like it was a pretty big bestseller at one time, but it's fallen off in the modern day. I would love to know why. Last but not least, we have a book that I feel really guilty about because I feel like I posted a video recently where I talked about how much I really enjoy Rebecca Ross and how much I was really looking forward to picking up this book in particular, which is her newest release. And that is Divine Rivals. This is kind of a World War I fantasy, which I know sounds bizarre, but it kind of worked. The world is set up in a similar way to World War I. And I think in general, the world was the most creative part of it because what's going on is a war is happening between gods. It's not necessarily between nations. And so like certain gods are calling on people to fight for them. In general, the world, fascinating. The book also features an enemies to lovers romance, and it also features a mystery component. And all three of those components I just mentioned, world building, enemies to lovers, the mystery, all of those things were pretty great. I just really did not enjoy the vibe of this book, if that makes sense. I felt depressed every time I read it. I actually felt like my mood went down when I picked this book up, which I think is weird to say, but I have that relationship with, in general, World War I historical fiction. It's why I don't pick it up very often, because I think it's very heavy and it just takes a lot out of me when I'm reading it. I would not in a million years have thought that I would have felt that way with a fantasy interpretation of it, but there was just a level of melancholy to me as I was reading this that made me not want to pick it up. And so I just ultimately decided to keep my mood uplifted, I was going to DNF it. I feel like that's a really weird reason to have DNF'd a book, but I just truly felt like my mood declined every time I was reading this. And so I felt like if I feel like I'm in a slump currently, this book will certainly put me in one. It's a real shame because I really do want to applaud Rebecca Ross as the author, because I feel like this was really creative. I feel like the characters were well drawn. I feel like their dynamics were interesting. I was really invested in the enemies to lovers romance because it actually did feel like enemies to lovers, but the tone just did not vibe with me. So I'm really glad that I set this one down actually, and I'm thinking it might be permanent. And so it seems like there are 2 here that are permanent DNFs and 2 that I do intend to come back to. And so I would love to know down below if you have read any of these, what your feelings were on them. Should I really commit to them? I would love to know too if you have been DNFing anything recently, but that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.